like throw something up on GitHub, go to Packagist, and they're like, hey, here's my repo, done, right? That's really pretty much all there is to it as long as you conform to the standard. It's really wide adoption because of this. Like if it's easy to use and it does good things for you, strangely enough, people start using it. And so Composer's everywhere. It's even in Drupal 8 at this point. And this has kind of led to a situation where we have all of these interoperable components. So yeah, unique namespaces allows for overlapping names. You can now take that external library that I told you good luck with earlier, and you can include it into Drupal, and as long as it's namespaced its classes, no problem, right? All of a sudden, something that was a total pain of a problem is now just simply gone. Use that external library. Have fun with it. Yeah, I said that. Yeah, and so obviously this leads to the same sort of things we've seen in Drupal for a really long time, where people can actively contribute to a project and push it forward. So I want to talk about Fig. Who in here is familiar with PHP Fig? Okay, like 4 people. All right, PHP Fig is the framework interoperability group. This is a group of people who are really dedicated to creating standards that any PHP project can embrace, right? Drupal's embraced a lot of them. Symfony's embraced a ton of them. All of these different standards are coming about. The first one you may have heard of is maybe PSR0. Anybody? PSR0? Right? This is a class autoloading standard. We have PSR1, which is a basic coding standard. Drupal's like, meh, screw that. PSR2, same story, different verse. Logger interface, believe it or not, Drupal conforms to this one. Thank you, Larry. So you rewrote Watchdog to actually conform to the PSR3, right?
A couple of us did.
Yeah. Cool. PSR4, improved autoloading. I'm not sure I can claim this, but I'm going to try, okay? People can try to prove me wrong, and maybe they will. I'm pretty sure Drupal 8 pushed forward the adoption of PSR4 within Composer more so than any other project, and we may have been the first PSR4 compliant project in the world. I'm not sure about it.
At our size, probably.
Well, we did push forward Composer autoloading, getting PSR4.
The Composer PSR4 support was written by a Drupal developer.
There's some more PSRs out there. You should talk with Larry if you want to know about 5, 6, and especially 7, which is super cool. No. Stack PHP, who knows what that is? Larry, okay. Yeah, all right. Great. Stack PHP. So we're teaching. That's what we're doing today. So Stack is essentially a group of people attempting to collaborate around Symfony's HTTP kernel, right? This isn't like people who are stuck using this code. These are people actively opting into using someone else's code, someone who published their code independently, someone who they have no control over, right? And they're saying, this is a standard we can get behind and use, right? And what it means is that, you know, any framework that begins using this and using it properly can actually interoperate to a certain degree with their various routing layers, right? And finally, component libraries. This should be kind of self-evident with the rest of the conversation thus far, but there are lots of different component libraries out there. Symfony components, Doctrine, Zend, that's what the ZF is. This is quickly leading us to like this interoperable vision of PHP, where you just say, I want a little bit of this, I want a little bit of that. I will write the glue code in between that makes this thing work, right? Does that sound familiar to anybody? Has anybody in the room been doing something similar to that for the last, I don't know, 5, 10 years? Maybe less. So Drupal, let's talk about Drupal. Drupal 8 specifically. Drupal 8 at this point is really a mixture of modules and PHP components. Okay, so we also still have kind of some procedural approaches within our code base. We've eliminated a lot of it, but you know, you can't ever completely get rid of that. And we've worked really hard to eliminate the low-hanging fruit that made a lot of sense, and some things that were much more difficult to eliminate, like our routing layer. A lot of these things have been converted into stateless services, which is to say, it's a good thing. And we have our own PHP components at this point. Drupal 8 literally has an entire directory just full of PHP code that we intend to make publicly available for people outside of Drupal to use. We don't have it exposed yet, but we're close. And Drupal just has a single Git repository. We need a subtree split, which isn't actually separate Git repositories. It's still one, but you get to treat it like it's multiple. So having talked about all of that, I want to talk a little bit about what I believe the future of Drupal is. And I believe very sincerely that Drupal is going to be a standardized collection of PHP components, right? Shareable with the PHP world at large. If you are using some project and you want to use Drupal's utility or plugins, something near and dear to my heart, that should be very achievable in the near future. Symfony, just like Symfony, right? You can pick and choose the pieces of Symfony you want. You don't have to use full stack, right? Oh, see, I even enumerated those. Look at that. Sorry, I went through these slides a while ago, my bad. Which all leads to this notion of a Drupal second approach. I think we should code for Drupal second, right? Write something that works, solve the case, and then build an adapter around it to Drupal. Right? I mean, you've been doing that for a long time with every API you had to work with, somebody else's module that you liked what it did, but it didn't integrate with CCK properly, whatever. Like, we've been actively doing these sorts of things for a long time. And I think if we were to begin doing it more publicly, releasing more components, we would get more buy-in. Yeah, that should be obvious from what I said. Really, though, I mean, maybe it's not obvious, because what are modules, right? Yeah, I said that. Create a PHP native solution. Write a Drupal adapter. Like, you start doing this, the code that you're producing is going to have to be higher quality, because you're going to write all the unit tests for it. You're going to host that stuff maybe on Drupal, maybe on GitHub, somewhere. You're going to have Travis integration to it. You're going to have all of this stuff just at your fingertips to begin actively testing what you build. And then building adapters? Like, who in here has ever built an adapter class, like one class wrapping another so that it can communicate with some different layer, right? Yeah. It's not hard. Usually it's like, oh, they named it that, I named it this, let's call that method here, right? These things are usually fairly simple to do. And especially if you're in charge of writing that generic code layer, yeah. If we do this, though, you have to ask the question, like, what happens to modules, right? Are modules even a thing? I think for Drupal 8, obviously they are. But we have to start making these decisions. What is a module? Do we do packages of modules still, right? Because that gets more complicated when you start looking at external dependencies or delivering this stuff together. Does anybody know what this is? Not Larry. What is it? It's a composer JSON file. That's exactly what it is. That is its name. That's its description. There are its authors, its requirements, other things it depends upon, how it can auto-load its classes. Does this look like anything to anybody else? Yeah? Does it look like, I don't know, an info file? It has all the exact same features, point for point, and many, many more, I'll mention. It's not Drupal, that's true. So it's not all roses. we do have modules that are beginning to depend upon PHP components, and that's kind of a hard nut to crack. We have Composer Manager, which has gotten rewritten since the last time I gave this presentation, and it's better than it's ever been before, and I think that there's some really great things happening with it. Does anybody use Composer Manager? Have you used it recently? Okay. It hooks into Drush now, so when you do an EN against your module, it finds the composer dependencies, downloads them, and installs them. Yeah, it's super cool. It's super cool. Thank you, Bojan Zivanovic. I mean, all my suggestions are worthless after like talking about that one. I was doing this through hook requirements for a while so that you had to actively go and download this. I don't think that's required anymore. Yeah, no. So I think this is kind of the money shot of the Drupal 8 story, though, is that Drupal 8 is really in a transitional stage. It's not one way or the other. It has a collection of PHP components. It still has this notion of Drupal modules. It still has hooks. It's got event dispatching. It's got all of these parallel systems. So we're going to have to figure that out, like, bottom line. But I think it's still a good thing. This is kind of an interesting point. The first time I gave this presentation was actually in Munich. And someone asked me about upstream dependencies, because obviously we have a few of those. We're depending upon Guzzle and Symfony and Sam Boyer and a bunch of things. And I looked at him and I said, well, that's a fair point, but it's not really any different than what you have today. Has anybody in the room ever used panels? Okay. Has anybody in the room who's ever used panels filed a panels bug? Okay, of those of you filing panels bugs, have you ever been told that's not a panels bug, that's a page manager bug? Yeah? Okay, same problem. These are detangling the dependencies of how modules interact. The same thing's going to happen within this new componentized future. Okay, same problems, different implementation. Yeah? It's funny you should ask. Because I really think that build process and version pinning must be the day. Like, that's what you have to do going forward. Anybody using Drush Make, right? If you're using Drush Make and you're pinning dev versions, shame on you. If you're getting it from Git and you haven't tagged a particular commit, shame on you, right? Like, the next guy who comes behind you and builds this, if you're collaborating with some other team of developers and they try to run your build and I've committed something to CTools since then, man, they are so screwed, right? Maybe. CTools is actually pretty good about it. But there are plenty of modules that aren't. I mean, a great example. This one sucks. I'm sorry, I'm not picking on you. Rules 2.4 totally screwed me over, right? Like, I couldn't even do DB update. It was done. Over. I had to figure out how to downgrade to 2.3 and figure it out. And you know, these things happen. Like, it just happens. That's a widely used module that I can pick on because it probably happened to some of you in the room and you're going to remember it. But, you know, and I was pinning versions, right? And when I did my upgrade, it was like, oh, well, that ain't going to work. So I backed off rules. No big deal. Okay, same thing's going to happen here. And so when we begin doing build processes that depend upon composer components or whatever we do in the future, it has the exact same abilities that Drush Make does, and you should definitely pin versions. It's the only way to do this sanely. And Composer even has a couple of extra things, like that Composer lock file, if you've dealt with it at all. Composer lock file is actually a great thing because it means that everybody gets the same version of everything all the time. So when I build the project that you're working on and someone else builds it and anybody else builds it, we're all collaborating against the same thing always. Suffice it to say, yeah, it's a potential problem, but there is a solution to it, right? Licensing, wow, do I even want to talk about that? All right, so most of the PHP components that you might run into today are typically MIT. There are a couple out there that are BSD, but most of them are MIT, right? Anybody not Larry know what Drupal is? Guess I'm showing you. It's GPL2+, right? Well, that means anything we've ever committed to the Drupal repository is GPL2+, period. If we start serving up different components as being their own thing, it's still GPL2+. If it's on Drupal.org, it's GPL2+, right? There may be some nuance to that. How does this relate to the Drupal second thing? You know, I guess you can make your own components, the license that makes sense to you. I personally, and I'm definitely in the minority here, but I personally would encourage you to make GPL components. I think that this has some really interesting security ramifications, and in this day, when we continue to run into security issues and privacy issues, that having the strongest license for that on our side is probably a good thing. It does limit the upside potential of your component in terms of who might adopt it, because there are some people out there who just want to use the code, and they don't want to be forced to give it back. Whatever they may use with it. If you go MIT and GPL can coexist in terms of what you might do on the Drupal side of this equation. Symfony is an MIT library, so is Guzzle. So is most of the things in the composer file. Core verse root. What did I say here? Meh. All right. This is the internet. Anybody know what percentage of it we occupy? I know, right? It's tubes, yeah. It's a series of tubes. Drupal occupies about 2% of the web. That is the number that we claim. And at least for the portion of the web that Acquia bothers to crawl, it is fairly true. And they crawl a very significant portion of it. This is WordPress, okay? Between Drupal and WordPress, we occupy a quarter of the web. Right? Anybody happen to know how much of it's PHP, that rest, the 75%? Not Larry? No? PHP, period. 5? It's 57%. So between Drupal, WordPress, and PHP at large, we run 82% of the web. We being PHP. Yeah, 82. There's the number, with exclamations and everything, right? So that's 28 times what Drupal runs all by itself, right? This is the group of people I'm talking about getting involved with, right? So here's kind of my breakdown of the whole talk, right? Drupal's built and maintained a really great working solution for the last 14 years, before PHP had anything worth considering, okay? We did a pretty good job. It served us well. But they've clearly caught up. They have a technically capable, similar solution that does everything ours does, and frankly, more. And if we were to adopt this, I think, and this is just me hypothesizing, but I think that the more components we create, the greater adoption of Drupal components we're going to see. So if dbtng were a separate component, I could see someone using that because they preferred it over Doctrine maybe. Plugins, utility, whatever. Like, if they have a problem with one of those things, if they need to learn it inside and out, who are they going to call? Right? They're going to call us, obviously. They're going to call the Drupal community in order to come solve their learning or support needs for a Drupal component, right? Yeah, so I think this is like a very clear sort of response to what the PHP world has done, is to simply like, if you can't beat them, join them, right? Clear future. We join them, we do what they do, we contribute to their same ethos and workflow. We're going to get a lot of really interesting benefits out of it. So I want to bring these back up. Where's PHP going? what will happen to PHP projects that don't adopt what the rest of PHP is doing? And more importantly, what is Drupal? And I'm just going to leave you with my answer to this last one, okay? My answer to what is Drupal is really simple. Drupal's a community. Drupal's the people at this event, right? Drupal's not necessarily a collection of software, though we may think that it is sometimes. But increasingly, as we abstract and pull apart that collection of software to operate independently, like what Drupal really is the community that builds that software. So, you know, these are just kind of my thoughts about what's happening here within PHP in the Drupal world. I'd be happy to entertain any questions you have. I have no idea how fast or slow I went. Yeah. Okay, so a little fast. Not too bad. Questions, anybody? And I won't exclude Larry. Well, I think, like looking at our largest rival, WordPress, they couldn't care less as best as I can tell. Having recently walked through some of their new OO code, I had to put it down because Larry has drilled into me way too many like dependency injection and things like that. And you know, I mean, yeah, Larry's taught me too well. I can't look at WordPress's code. And that's not like to deride them. Obviously, they've done a really good job at what they do, right?
Well, we were there too, just a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, about 3 of them. Just about 3 of them. I could look through most of Drupal 7's code base and feel the same way, right? So, you know, like I said, it's not to deride them, but that's not a priority for them. They're busy taking over the world in a completely different way, right? You know, if there's one to talk about, it's probably Laravel, right? Which is definitely component-based and, you know, moving forward there. And I mean, you've got, I think what's more interesting to see than Drupal's an interesting beast of its own, so we'll put it aside. But if you look at the WordPresses of the world, of which there aren't really many, they aren't really moving towards this at all. But we're seeing all these little micro frameworks and things like that pop up, like Laravel, Silex, those sorts of things, and they're all embracing this. Yeah, Larry?
Can I disagree with you?
Yeah, disagree away. No, you may not.
From what I'm seeing in the PHP community, there's 3 classes of project. Projects that are based on or trying to move towards this modern componentized model. Projects that are in the process of dying, and WordPress.
Okay.
So PHPBB, now based on Symfony.
Right.
Easy Publish,
Now based on Symfony.
Laravel, using Symfony components. Zen Framework and Symfony are both shifting towards being component libraries with some glue as an afterthought. This is actually a very broad trend among projects that actually matter.
Yeah, well, and I think it's interesting to just put WordPress in their own category because they're definitely not dying. I think long term, you know, like what they've really succeeded at is being hyper user friendly. Now, having used WordPress pretty extensively over the course of the last 10 months, I don't understand that analogy. Like people say that all the time. I don't really see it as being particularly more friendly than most of the Drupal stuff I do on a day-to-day basis, but it's definitely got a simpler concept that you can bootstrap sooner. So maybe that's where they're succeeding. But they're quickly attempting to infringe like on Drupal's space around, you know, typical like structured data sort of processes, and they haven't cracked that nut yet. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. It's because any sort of migration process is going to be utter hell for them. But, you know, they still have obviously a huge user base, and that's not going to go away quickly, no matter what the technical underpinnings of their solution. So, yeah, I mean, like to characterize as anybody not adopting this or WordPress as dying, maybe that's totally fair. But a lot of projects have like figured it out. I mean, PHPBB, come on, like for so long, they've had a really great forum, but they've had serious security issues on and off for forever. And, they're getting really serious about their code base. They're adopting this componentized solution. I think, they could be a really serious contender going forward on the forum side, which, interesting note, Drupal started as a forum. I guess take that information and do with it what you will. Other questions? Yeah.
So how do you see, you mentioned like components versus modules, like going on beyond 8, like 9 or 10 or something like that. Like how do you see that like shaken out? Like where there would be maybe some type of module wrapper hosted on DO, and then you would run Composer to pull down the external dependency. Something like that, or
Totally something like that. Or we move to a situation where modules are composerable, right? Which they kind of already are. There are some things you can do to Composer to make modules be composerable. You can do a Composer install and end up with Drupal modules. But like, I would like to see us actually embrace real legitimate Composer support and essentially turn Drupal.org into our own packagist install for that sort of stuff. But there's some nuance to doing that and what it actually means on the code side, right? Because a Drupal module, it runs in Drupal. Thus, Drupal module, right? So I guess what I'm really advocating is that we begin seriously thinking about what it looks like for it not to run in Drupal. If we happen to be running the same routing system as everybody else, which by the way we largely do, then what's holding us back from writing code that Laravel could adopt, right? Or Silex or any of these things. I mean, if we build it, will they come, so to speak? Yeah. And that's actually the reason I talk about licensing, because I think the answer is sure, if it's good, right? If we build something worthwhile and worth using, we've got 14 years of history showing that people will absolutely come and use it, So I guess the bottom line to that one is I really hope that we get to a point where I can just add a require statement for CTools and boom, I've got it, right? That's what I'd like to see happening. Other questions? No other questions?
What, if any, like, are there downsides to this? Are there potential hazards to Drupal taking this approach that would be like,
I don't know. I feel like
what am I not thinking that I should be thinking in asking you about it?
I think that that's a totally fair question, and I don't actually have an answer. So maybe it's like, I don't know. Let's think about it. What are the downsides? I think.
Or like, what would be barriers to adoption of this, like, to keep the Drupal community from deciding, yeah, this ought to go?
Yeah, I think like there's some really obvious ones right off the bat. We have certain things that aren't componentized yet that should be, right? We have other legacy code within Drupal that's going to be really hard to pull out. Case in point, form, right? Like form API is a big deal, and we've made some really cool changes to it in Drupal 8. If you haven't played with it yet, form state is its own object, which is a ton easier to deal with than it's ever been before, but I digress. But Symfony has their own form component, which some Symfony form component maintainers sat down with Drupal form component maintainers and convinced them that they could totally switch to Symfonies. Nobody attempted that because it's going to be a really big thing, and we already did a lot in 8. But I think form holds this back for all of 8, no doubt. Like until we decide to remove form, we are going to be building Drupal-specific code, right? I think really clearly that's obvious to me.